Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. The roar of heavy machinery shattered the quiet morning, sending tremors through the ground as a massive bulldozer tore into the final standing wall. Splintered wood, shattered glass, and crushed furniture littered the area where a house once stood. Dust curled into the air, the last remnants of a home that had been reduced to nothing but rubble. Workers in hard hats stood around, some looking on indifferently, others shifting uncomfortably. They had done demolitions before, but something about this one felt off. A black SUV rolled up, its tires crunching over broken debris. The door swung open, and out stepped a man in a crisp suit, his dark sunglasses masking the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Ethan Walker took in the scene before him, his jaw tightening as his hands curled into fists. But he didn't speak. He didn't demand explanations from the construction crew or shout in fury. He simply stood there, letting the scene sink in. They had made a mistake, a colossal mistake. The house was gone. His house, the home he had built with his own hands, the place where he spent his few moments of peace between long, grueling assignments. Everything inside, his clothes, his personal belongings, his work files, was reduced to dust. And not just any files, highly classified federal case documents. The HOA had made their move. Now it was his turn. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, his voice unervingly steady as he spoke. "We have a problem. Get here now." He ended the call and slid the phone back in his coat, his gaze never leaving the wreckage. Across town, inside an air-conditioned office lined with certificates and awards, Caleb Montgomery leaned back in his chair, a smug grin playing on his lips. His golf club tapped lazily against the carpeted floor as he basked in his latest victory. Another house gone, another blight removed from his perfect neighborhood. He lifted his overpriced espresso to his lips, letting out a satisfied sigh. "That eyesore is history," he muttered to himself. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He exhaled in annoyance, glancing at his secretary, Hannah, as she peeked inside. "Sir, there's a man here to see you." Caleb barely glanced up. "Tell them to take it up with the appeals board. If they didn't follow the regulations, that's their problem, not mine." Hannah hesitated. "I think you should see him." Before he could respond, the door swung open. Ethan Walker stepped inside, removing his sunglasses and revealing piercing eyes that locked onto Caleb like a predator sizing up its prey. He walked forward, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. His expression remained unreadable, but the tension in the air was suffocating. "I want an explanation." Caleb barely spared him a glance. "And you are?" Ethan placed a document onto the desk with deliberate force. The crisp white paper, stamped with official seals, bore his name in bold, undeniable clarity. Caleb's smirk faltered for the first time. "The owner of the house your people just bulldozed," and said, his voice deathly calm. Caleb's eyes flicked between Ethan and the document, regaining his composure quickly. "I think you're mistaken," he said, leaning back in his chair. The house that was demolished today was abandoned and in violation of multiple HOA regulations. Ethan didn't move, his gaze unwavering. "Read it again." Caleb hesitated, then picked up the paper. His confident smirk disappeared completely as he read the title deed. Ethan Walker, named clear as day. The house had been legally owned, taxes paid, no outstanding violations. The color drained from Caleb's face for only a second before he forced himself to chuckle, waving a dismissive hand. "Well, mistakes happen," he said, as if this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "I'm sure we can come to some sort of agreement." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "An agreement? My home is gone. Everything in it is gone. I don't think oops quite covers that." Caleb leaned forward, regaining some of his arrogance. "Look, Walker, these things happen. The HOA has the legal right to demolish properties in violation of community standards. If you feel there's been a mistake, you're welcome to file a complaint." He chuckled. "Good luck with that." Ethan studied him for a long moment before leaning in slightly. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made Caleb shift uncomfortably in his chair. You have no idea who you just messed with. Caleb smirked. Oh, I think I do. You're just another homeowner who thinks he's special. He set the deed back onto the desk and crossed his arms. Trust me, we've handled plenty of people like you before. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, considering something. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. Caleb chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Another arrogant homeowner who thought he could fight the HOA. What he didn't know was that Ethan Walker wasn't just a homeowner. He was a federal agent, and this wasn't over. That evening, in a sleek government office miles away, Ethan sat in silence, fingers tapping against the desk as his lawyer, Natalie Brooks, laid out his options. They really screwed up, she said, flipping through the HOA's bylaws. Not only was the demolition illegal, but the way they went about it is practically begging for a lawsuit. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. And that's just the legal side of things, he murmured. They also destroyed highly classified federal case files. Now Natalie's head snapped up. Wait, what? My home office contains sensitive documents, Ethan said, his voice measured. Documents related to ongoing federal investigations. She paled. You realize what this means, right? That's not just a civil case anymore. That's a federal security breach. Ethan nodded, adjusting his tie, which means the HOA didn't just bulldoze the wrong house. He exhaled slowly. They bulldozed their way into a federal nightmare. Meanwhile, back at the HOA office, Caleb sat at his desk chuckling as he sipped his espresso. Hannah knocked again before poking. Her head in, sir. Ethan Walker is back. Caleb's smirk froze before he could react. The door swung open again. Ethan Walker walked in, calm, collected, and cold. He wasn't just here for a chat. He was here to send a message. Caleb Montgomery leaned back in his chair, the soft hum of his office's air conditioning filling the room as he basked in the satisfaction of another so-called victory. He swirled overpriced espresso in his cup, staring out the window of the HOA headquarters, watching the neatly maintained neighborhood he had worked so hard to perfect. In his mind, he was a visionary, a man who kept order in a community that would otherwise fall into chaos. His job wasn't about fairness, it was about control. The homeowners might complain, but in the end, they all played by his rules because they had no choice. His secretary, Hannah, entered the room hesitantly. Sir, Ethan Walker is back. Caleb barely looked up from his cup. Tell him to take it up with the appeals board. He's not asking, she said quietly. Before Caleb could respond, the door swung open, and Ethan stepped inside with slow, deliberate movements. The tension in the air shifted instantly. Ethan took off his sunglasses, revealing an expression that was unsettlingly calm. His gaze locked onto Caleb, cold and unwavering, like a predator who had already calculated its next move. I want an explanation. His voice was quiet, controlled. Caleb raised an unimpressed brow. And you are? Ethan didn't respond with words. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled out a crisp document, and placed it onto the desk with a deliberate thud. Caleb glanced at it, his smirk barely flickering until he read the name on the deed. Ethan Walker. The house wasn't abandoned. It wasn't a violation of HOA regulations. It wasn't even in dispute. It was legally owned, taxes paid, everything in perfect order. The HOA had no right to demolish it. Caleb's smirk faltered for only a second before he quickly recovered, leaning back with a dismissive wave. Well, mistakes happen, he said smoothly. I'm sure we can come to some sort of agreement. Ethan's face remained unreadable. An agreement? His voice was quieter now, more dangerous. My home is gone. Everything in it is gone. I don't think oops quite covers that. Caleb exhaled through his nose, regaining his composure. Look, Walker, these things happen. The HOA has the legal right to demolish properties in violation of community standards. If you feel there's been a mistake, you're welcome to file a complaint. He chuckled. Good luck with that. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying him, not with the frustration of an angry homeowner, but with something else, something calculating. Caleb shifted slightly in his seat, not liking the feeling of being scrutinized like that. You have no idea who you just messed with, Ethan said softly. Caleb smirked again. Oh, I think I do. You're just another homeowner who thinks he's special. He set the deed back onto the desk, crossing his arms. Trust me, we've handled plenty of people like you before. Han didn't say another word. He simply stared at Caleb for a few more seconds, then turned and walked out of the office. For a moment, Caleb just sat there, his smirk slowly returning. Another arrogant resident who thought they could fight the HOA. Another fool who didn't understand how things worked. At the next HOA board meeting, Caleb stood at the head of the conference room table, surveying the people around him. The board members sipped their coffees, nodding along as he detailed his latest accomplishment. The Oak Ridge HOA had successfully cleaned up another problematic property, ensuring that the neighborhood's value remained intact. Ladies and gentlemen, Caleb announced, we have finally rid this community of an unsightly property that was dragging down our values. The board made a bold decision, and now our neighborhood is one step closer to perfection. The room was filled with murmurs of agreement. A few members clapped, some nodded with self-satisfaction, but not everyone was convinced. Ryan, a nervous-looking board member, cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. Caleb, are we sure that house was actually abandoned? I mean, we didn't. Caleb cut him off with an easy, practiced smile. The paperwork was processed. The demolition team did their job. If anyone has a problem with it, they can take it up with our appeals system. He leaned forward, flashing his teeth. And we all know how well that works. The room chuckled, except for Ryan, who looked like he wanted to sink under the table. Caleb leaned back, exuding confidence. Besides, he added smugly, what's one house across town? Ethan Walker sat in a sleek government office, his fingers tapping against his desk as his lawyer, Natalie Brooks, flipped through the HOA bylaws. They really screwed up, Ethan said, shaking her head. Not only was the demolition illegal, but the way they went about it is practically begging for a lawsuit. Ethan didn't respond. His gaze was distant, but there was something sharp in it, something that made even Natalie uneasy. And that's just the legal side of things, he said finally, his voice low and measured. They also destroyed highly classified federal case files. Natalie froze. Her fingers tightened around the stack of papers. Wait, what? My home office contains sensitive documents, Ethan said. Documents related to ongoing federal investigations. She paled. You realize what this means, right? That's not just a civil case anymore. That's a federal security breach. Ethan nodded, adjusting his tie, which means the HOA didn't just bulldoze the wrong house. He exhaled slowly. They bulldozed their way into a federal nightmare. Back at the HOA office, Caleb Montgomery sat at his desk, chuckling as he sipped his espresso. He had handled angry homeowners before. He had been sued before. He had won every single time. Hannah knocked again before poking her head in. Sir, Ethan Walker is back. Caleb's smirk froze before he could react. The door swung open again, and Ethan Walker walked in, calm, collected, and confident. He wasn't just here for a chat. He was here to send a message. Ethan Walker stood outside the HOA headquarters, his expression unreadable, his mind already 10 steps ahead. This wasn't just about his house anymore. It wasn't about his personal belongings or even the blatant disregard for the law. The moment those bulldozers tore through his home, they had done something far worse. They had interfered with federal operations, and that meant the rules had changed. His phone buzzed. He answered without looking at the screen. Tell me you have something. Natalie Brooks's voice was crisp and businesslike. Oh, I have plenty. The HOA is screwed. Ethan stepped toward his car as she continued flipping through the HOA's own bylaws. Not only was the demolition illegal, but it directly violated their own procedures. No notices, no hearings, no paperwork. Nothing. They thought they could bury it under a pile of red tape. But guess what? The documents they used to justify it were forged. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Forgery. That was a good start. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, Natalie added. They have a history of using loopholes to seize properties, slapping homeowners with ridiculous fines and code violations until they either give up or sell their homes at a loss. It's been happening for years. That didn't surprise him. He had seen too many power-hungry people abuse systems meant to protect. But this time, they had picked the wrong man. Ethan, Her voice dropped slightly. "We have a much bigger problem." He already knew what she was about to say. "The case files?" "Yeah. The fact that classified federal documents were destroyed when they leveled your house. That turns this into a national security issue." She paused, and "I made a few calls of my own. The FBI is interested." That was all he needed to hear. Across town, Caleb Montgomery sat in the HOA's boardroom, exuding his usual smug confidence. The other board members murmured among themselves, uneasy about the rumors swirling after the confrontation with Ethan Walker. But Caleb dismissed their concerns with a wave of his hand. "We have nothing to worry about," he said smoothly. "The HOA has the legal authority to enforce community standards. If this Walker guy wants to cry about it, let him. By the time he gets through all the bureaucratic nonsense, we'll have moved on." Ryan, the nervous board member, cleared his throat. "Are you sure? I mean, the way he looked at you in your office, he didn't seem like the kind of guy who just moves on." Caleb scoffed. "So what? He files a lawsuit. Our legal team handles those all the time. This isn't the first homeowner to complain." Ryan looked unconvinced, but he didn't argue. He never did. That evening, Ethan met with a small team in a secure government office. A digital display flickered to life on the wall, pulling up a detailed history of the Oak Ridge HOA documents, financial records, and case files. Sarah, an analyst, turned to him. "This HOA has been operating like a mafia. Fines issued for non-ex." Ryan, the board's weakest link, looked like he was about to pass out. His voice was shaky as he spoke. "We need to figure out how to handle this. The lawsuit, the investigation, this isn't like the other times. This is federal." Caleb exhaled slowly, pressing his fingertips together. "We stay calm. We don't panic. The media loves to blow things out of proportion, but we've seen cases like this before. It will pass." Hannah, his secretary, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, the H's accounts have been frozen." The words hit like a gut punch. Caleb's grip on his chair tightened. "Excuse me?" "The bank confirmed it this morning. No transactions can be made while the investigation is pending." That meant no HOA fees, no emergency funds, no money. Caleb forced a smirk. "Fine, so we take this to court. We'll get it unfrozen." Ryan cleared his throat again. "We, don't have a lawyer." Caleb frowned. "What do you mean we don't have a lawyer?" She quit. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something close to fear. His attorney, his high-powered, ruthless, do-anything-to-win lawyer had walked away. That wasn't normal. That meant she knew this case was already lost. Across town, Ethan Walker leaned back in his chair as he listened to his contact at the FBI. The operation was moving faster than expected. The Financial Crimes Division had already begun sifting through HOA records, and the IRS was deep into an audit that would uncover years of fraudulent transactions. Every fake fine, every siphoned dollar into offshore accounts, every home illegally seized. It was all there, neatly documented in files Caleb had thought no one would ever see. Sarah, the lead investigator, pulled up another report on the screen in front of them. "This HOA isn't just corrupt, it's criminal. They've been stealing from homeowners for years. Fake maintenance fees, forged notices, illegally inflating dues. And get this, dozens of homeowners were forced out of their homes through fraudulent fines, and those properties just so happened to end up in the hands of Caleb's business partners." Ethan didn't react, but inside he felt the familiar burn of anger. This wasn't just about his house anymore. These people had ruined lives. That ended today. At precisely 9 a.m., black SUVs pulled up in front of the HOA headquarters. The neighborhood, once ruled by Caleb Montgomery's iron grip, was about to watch him fall. Inside his office, Caleb barely had time to process what was happening before the door burst open. FBI agents entered, their presence sucking the air from the room. The lead agent's voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Montgomery, we need to have a word about your financial records." Caleb swallowed hard. His usual smirk was gone. He tried to put on a show of confidence, but the weight of the situation was too much. "This is ridiculous. You people can't just barge in here." The agent set a thick folder on his desk, pages and pages of evidence. "You are under investigation for financial fraud, tax evasion, and unauthorized property destruction." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. His desk, his entire empire was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Homeowners, people Caleb had terrorized for years, stood watching as law enforcement poured into the HOA office. Some whispered, some pointed, but most simply smiled. Ryan was the first board member to crack. The moment agents began questioning him, he spilled everything. "I didn't know the demolitions were illegal," he stammered. "I just followed orders." It was Caleb. He made all the final decisions. Other board members turned on Caleb just as fast. One by one, they started distancing themselves, cutting deals, making statements. By the afternoon, it was official. The Oak Ridge HOA was finished. Ethan stood across the street watching it all unfold. It was satisfying, but he wasn't done yet. He wanted to make sure Caleb Montgomery never had a single chance to rise again. At exactly 5 p.m., the final blow landed. The IRS released their findings. Caleb had embezzled HOA funds for years. Lavish vacations, luxury items, private investments. All of it using money stolen from homeowners through fake fines and maintenance fees. And then came the warrant. FBI agents returned that evening, this time with handcuffs. As Caleb was led out of his office, the neighborhood erupted in cheers. Someone shouted, "Hey Caleb, how does it feel to get a taste of your own medicine?" He clenched his jaw, refusing to respond. The cameras were rolling. His face, his downfall would be on every news station by the morning. Ethan watched, arms crossed, as Caleb was loaded into a waiting SUV. This was only the beginning. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of the empty lot where his house once stood. The wreckage had been cleared away, leaving nothing but a barren patch of land. But to him, it wasn't a loss. It was an opportunity. The Oak Ridge HOA was gone, its corrupt board members scattered, and its former president, Caleb Montgomery, was sitting in a jail cell awaiting trial for fraud, embezzlement, and destruction of property. But Ethan wasn't just content with taking them down legally. He wanted to make sure their legacy of corruption was wiped from existence, and he had the perfect plan to do it. Across town, Caleb sat in the cold, gray holding cell of the county jail. His suit, once perfectly pressed and expensive, was now wrinkled and stained with sweat. His lawyer had given him nothing but bad news for the last 2 hours. The charges against him weren't just piling up, they were crushing him. And the worst part? His own board members had turned on him. One by one, they were cutting deals with the prosecutors, testifying against him in exchange for leniency. He was alone. The next morning, a large delivery truck pulled up in front of what used to be the Oak Ridge HOA office. The building, now an empty shell after being seized in the legal fallout, was about to become something new. Residents gathered, whispering, wondering what Ethan was up to. Then the workers unveiled a sign. A dog park, a massive, beautifully designed, completely free-to-use dog park built on the very land where the highway once dictated every aspect of people's lives. But the best part was the name displayed on a large, gleaming sign at the entrance, Caleb's Leash-Free Zone. Laughter erupted from the crowd. People cheered. It was poetic justice at its finest, and Ethan stood among them, arms crossed, watching as the community celebrated their newfound freedom. But he wasn't done yet. The very next day, another project began. Instead of rebuilding his house, Ethan had bigger plans for the empty lot where it once stood. The neighborhood watched as workers arrived, laying foundations, erecting signs, and carefully planting greenery. When the project was complete, it was something no one had expected, a neighborhood park. But not just any park. At the center stood a plaque inscribed with the words, "In memory of every homeowner who suffered under the Oak Ridge HOA. You're finally free." It was more than just a message. It was a symbol of everything Ethan had fought for. A place where families could gather, children could play, and people could live their lives without fear of fines and harassment. But the final, most humiliating blow came in the form of the giant LED billboard installed at the entrance of the park. It played a looped video of Caleb Montgomery being arrested. Caleb, watching the news from his holding cell, saw the footage and screamed in rage. Meanwhile, the last asset of the Oak Ridge HOA, their office building, was put up for auction to cover their legal debts. Ethan bought it without hesitation. He had no intention of using it for anything related to HOA operations. Instead, he turned it into a community center where homeowners could seek legal advice on how to fight corrupt HOAs. And for the grand finale, Ethan made one final move, one that ensured the HOA could never return. He legally dissolved it. No more HOA board, no more arbitrary fines, no more power-hungry officials dictating what people could do with their own property. The Oak Ridge HOA, once a tyrannical force in the community, ceased to exist. That evening, the community gathered in the new park, celebrating their first ever HOA-free weekend. Families played games, music filled the air, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. Ethan stood among them, watching with quiet satisfaction. He had taken everything from the people who had tried to ruin his life, and in return, he had given something back to the people who truly deserved it. The next morning, a delivery truck pulled up to Caleb Montgomery's apartment. He had been released on bail, but his fortune was gone, his assets frozen, and his reputation irreparably destroyed. His fingers trembled as he tore open the package left at his doorstep. Inside was a framed photo of Ethan Walker standing in front of the newly built park, smiling. Beneath it was a handwritten note. "Next time, read the deed before you bulldoze a house." Caleb roared in fury and hurled the frame across the room. It didn't matter. Ethan had already won. Ethan Walker leaned back in his chair, staring out at the newly built park that now occupied the space where his house once stood. The sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air as families enjoyed their first weekend free from the grip of the HOA. Children played on the swings. Dogs ran freely in what was once the HOA's headquarters, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a true community again. He had won. He had taken down the Oak Ridge HOA, humiliated Caleb Montgomery, and ensured that no one would ever suffer under their corruption again. But as he sat there, his phone buzzed. He answered without hesitation, already recognizing the number. "We have a problem," Natalie Brooks said, her voice serious. Ethan's smirk faded. "What is it?" "Caleb's out." His grip on the phone tightened. "House arrest." "Yeah." His lawyers pulled some strings. "He's not walking free, but he's not rotting in a cell either." She hesitated before continuing. "And here's the kicker. He's already meeting with investors." Ethan sat up straighter. "What kind of investors?" "The kind that want to start a new HOA." Silence filled the line for a moment. Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Where?" Natalie sighed. "A few miles from here. They're looking at some old real estate developments. No official name yet, but I found some paperwork filed under Montgomery Property Management." Ethan let out a slow breath, his jaw clenching. So, Caleb wasn't done. He was trying to rebuild his empire under a new name. Natalie continued. "It's small right now, just a few properties, but we both know how fast he moves. If we don't stop him now, he's going to spread like a virus all over again." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, thinking. Caleb had learned nothing. Even after losing everything, even after being publicly humiliated and exposed for his corruption, he still refused to let go of his obsession with control. But Ethan had spent his entire career hunting down people who thought they were untouchable. Caleb was just another name on that list. Now he finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "Then I guess I'll have to pay him a visit." Later that evening, in a dimly lit office on the outskirts of town, Caleb Montgomery sat across from a group of investors, pitching his new project. His once pristine suit was replaced with a more subdued, almost desperate look, but the smug confidence in his tone remained. "I made a mistake in Oak Ridge," Caleb admitted, leaning forward. "I trusted the wrong people, and I let my enemies catch me off guard. But this time, I'm going to do things differently." The investors exchanged glances. "We need assurance that what happened in Oak Ridge won't happen here," one of them said. Caleb smirked. "I can guarantee it. I've learned from my mistakes. No loopholes, no loose ends, just results." A knock on the office door interrupted him. His assistant peeked in, her expression uncertain. "Mr. Montgomery, someone's here to see you." "I'm in the middle of something, tell them." Before he could finish, the door swung open. Ethan Walker stepped inside. The investors turned in confusion, but Caleb's face drained of color. Ethan walked forward, slow and deliberate, before taking a seat across from Caleb. His eyes locked onto him with quiet amusement. "Starting fresh, are we?" Ethan said casually, glancing at the files on the desk. "Montgomery Property Management, nice ring to it." Caleb clenched his jaw. "You have no business here." Ethan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "See, that's where you're wrong. You're trying to do the same thing you did before. You're trying to manipulate, to control, to own people." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm here to make sure that never happens again." Caleb forced a smirk. "You can't stop me. You won't find any fraud this time. Everything I'm doing is perfectly legal." Ethan chuckled under his breath. "For now." Caleb's fingers tapped against the desk, but the flicker of nervousness in his eyes gave him away. The investors, sensing the tension, began gathering their things. "I think we should reschedule this meeting," one of them muttered, standing up. Caleb shot Ethan a glare. "You think you could just walk in here and scare me off?" Ethan stood up slowly. "I don't need to scare you, Caleb. You're going to destroy yourself again." He turned toward the door, but stopped before leaving. "And if you don't," he glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Then I'll be back." As he stepped outside, the night air was cool, but his mind was already focused on what came next. He had won the first battle, but Caleb wasn't the type to go down quietly. This wasn't over, not yet.